I'm here with Shirley Bond, who's the MLA for Prince George-Valemount. Shirley, welcome back to Valemount.
Thank you. Always a pleasure to be here.
Always great to have you. You had a nice talk today, hosted by the Chamber of Commerce, and had a chance to cover a lot of topics. I just wanted to kind of go through a few of them and just ask a few questions, if we could, about that. First of all, I wanted to talk about the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Obviously, the things have changed recently. The federal government has purchased the Trans Mountain Pipeline. You said in your talk today that you were disappointed in the federal government's decision to do that. Why so?
Well, I think I'm more disappointed in the provincial government's approach to the pipeline. The federal government did what it needed to do to move forward a project that was in the national interest, and the project has been deemed in the national interest. So in essence, because of the actions taken here in British Columbia, the federal government in many ways had no choice. If they wanted the project to proceed, they decided that they were going to be responsible for moving that project forward. In my view, the project could have proceeded as a private sector project. We certainly had people who were willing to take on that responsibility. I'm a strong supporter of the private sector economy. So I think that the provincial government here, our decision, the decision that was made by our government, the provincial government, forced the hand of the federal government to move this project forward. So my disappointment is in the fact that what could have been a private sector project in British Columbia will now be funded by taxpayers. I don't think that was necessary, but again, I think that was a reaction to the reluctance to move this project forward by the NDP government.
It's a very controversial project in some ways. Many supporters in this region and many detractors in this region as well. But there are a lot of protests and feelings of some First Nations that they weren't heard in the initial discussions. How do you see it playing out?
Well, I'm very concerned. I mean, you're absolutely right. There are very strongly held views on both sides of the argument. But I think that when you speak about First Nations, response to this project, they don't speak with one voice. There are very many First Nations along the pipeline corridor, in fact, who are very supportive of the project. And I know even here in my own riding of Prince George-Valemount, there is not universal support. What I support is responsible resource development. We've seen Kinder Morgan do a project here in the Robson Valley. I was the MLA at the time when they did the Anchor Loop project, which actually went through Mount Robson Park, and I was very concerned about that. But there was a responsible approach taken to that by the company. So this is not an easy issue. It's a complex one, strong views. But in my view, I think it's necessary that we look at ways that we can develop the resource economy in British Columbia. If you're going to have a strong and thriving economy, I think the private sector has a role to play in that. And my bigger concern is probably the message that this kind of action sends to the rest of the world about investing in British Columbia. Investors are not going to choose to be in a jurisdiction where there's uncertainty, where there's conflict. Capital is very mobile, and people are going to choose to develop elsewhere. And I think that is a big problem as we look to the future of our province.
You also talked about the speculation tax, and I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but in the last census that was done here, it showed that 1 out of every 5 homes in Valemount is actually vacant, and it's owned by out of province usually, but out of town certainly, property owners. Right now we have a housing shortage in Valemount, bordering on a housing crisis. It's very difficult for people to find housing. It's extremely difficult to find affordable housing. How do you think the speculation tax will affect Valemount, and what do you see as a possible solution to helping our situation?
Well, first of all, Valemount is not captured by the speculation tax at this point, but I've met with people who are concerned that it may be at some point in time. So at the moment, there isn't a speculation tax in place, and I do think there is a place for legitimately dealing with people who speculate in the housing market. I think how you determine who that is and what they own and what you do, I think you need to take the time to figure that out. But a blanket tax that impacts people who have two homes, for example, that needs to be looked at quite differently. It's not a true speculation tax. People could be taxed on an inheritance, for example, a cabin that they've inherited from their families. So I think that affordable housing is an issue across British Columbia. We need to look at ways to incent more capacity in the market. One of the issues is, do we have enough? And so supply matters too. So it's a complicated situation. I think people would not necessarily assume that housing affordability is a challenge here in the Robson Valley, and we need to do a better job of explaining to British Columbia that yes, it's a challenge even here. So not an easy answer. My criticism is based on the fact that I think you need to, if you're gonna call it a speculation tax, then make sure it applies to those who speculate, not just a broad tax that impacts people perhaps who own a family cabin. So, you know, there's been some adjustments made by the government. Our region is not included in the tax at the moment, and we need to watch very carefully about the next steps the government takes.
I think beyond the actual speculation tax, we do have a lot of speculation going on here in Valemount. I mean, we are a resort community under the Resort Municipality Initiative, but with the ski resort, the Valemount Glacier Destination Ski Resort, a lot of people are speculating on land and on property here. I've seen in the last 5 years property prices double, in some cases triple here, and the amount of vacancies is becoming alarming for young families and others to do it. And I think we need a strategy not only just here in Valemount, but in other areas that are affected in this way, because housing is becoming a problem, and people are paying, you know, more than half of their income for housing, and it's just not sustainable.
You know, I think it's very accurate to say that we are certainly seeing housing prices increase in Valemount, and you're right. People are looking and anticipating the arrival of the resort and a variety of other things, and they're taking advantage of that. So I have no disagreement with the fact that we do need to find ways to make sure that the first priority is affordable housing for people who choose to live here and have. And I think if it was an easy solution, governments would have figured it out by now. I think we do need to look at legitimate speculation and figure out how we limit that in the market. And I think there's more work to be done on that front. So the government, to their credit, has made the provision of affordable housing a priority, and I think we need to recognize the work that they have done on that. But part of my job as the MLA is going to be to continue to monitor the impact of housing prices on families here and take the message to Victoria that affordable housing is not just an issue in Vancouver or Victoria, but that we're seeing that in some of the rural parts of British Columbia where people are seeing the benefits of living in a community like this one. So lots of work to do, not an easy problem to solve, but I think it starts with genuinely articulating who's speculating, what they're doing with that property, and what they're doing with that land. And I think there are some things that we can do to help sort out that issue.
Yeah, I think it's going to be an important one. On the topic of housing, I'm going to talk about seniors housing and seniors care. I'm involved with the seniors housing. I'm on the board here. We have a long waiting list for seniors housing as it is here, not a limited space. We have no assisted living here, which is a step above that where there would be meals and light housekeeping. Then there's a step above that, which is the extended care. Of course, we don't have that at all. So families are being separated here, having to send their loved ones to either McBride or PG or to Kamloops or Jasper or Hinton or wherever the case might be. The Liberal government has always been a proponent of actions for seniors and working with seniors. How do you see us maybe moving forward in a positive direction to provide some additional housing options for seniors?
Well, it's such an important thing, you know, and I have had stories and constituents who've talked to me about having their family member in Jasper or elsewhere because there's not the kind of support that they need here in Valemount and McBride. And I think, again, it comes down to how do you get the message across to government that those kinds of services are absolutely essential closer to home. It doesn't matter where you live. You want to be able to stay and live and spend the the last parts of your life in a community that you love, surrounded by your family. So, you know, I have a great working relationship with BC Housing, for example, and you know, despite being in the opposition bench, it's a little harder to get attention. But, you know, we do need to provide the kinds of information to the health minister, to the seniors minister, to talk about the gaps that we feel exist. You know, there needs to be ongoing discussions with Northern Health and with BC Housing. And I think part of it is simply making sure they understand the kinds of gaps that we're facing. So there's been a lot of proactive work done here in Valemount by people who have worked on the seniors file. And we have made some progress, but is there more work to be done? Absolutely. And I look forward to taking those concerns to Victoria to talk about the need, especially for assisted living and just more an increase in capacity.
Another thing you spoke passionately about today was proportional representation. And I like to think of myself as a fairly intelligent person. I have a lot of trouble understanding what this is all about. So I'm going to ask you if you can just please kind of break it down as simply as possible. What is the difference between first past the post, which is our current electoral system, and proportional representation? What are we talking about here? Because the average person, I'm telling you, their eyes glaze over as soon as you mention the topic. But it's important.
I think my biggest concern is exactly the issue that you've expressed. Most people have no idea, first of all, that a referendum is underway. We're actually in the referendum period as we speak. And a ballot package, a voting package, is going to arrive in their doorstep starting on October the 22nd, and they have until November the 30th to actually make a decision. I wish I could explain it as simply as you would like me to. It is a very complex set of choices that British Columbians are being asked to make. But the basic change will be that a decision around who your MLA is will be based on the proportionality of the vote that occurs in a riding or across the province. The challenge we face is the models that are being suggested. We don't actually know what model will be in place at this point in time. British Columbians are being asked to rank potentially 3 different models of how you elect your MLA. So it's not as simple as saying, here's the basic difference. Every model has different nuances. There's the possibility of the use of party lists, where political parties in British Columbia would actually create a list of candidates, and depending upon the proportion of the vote that they receive, a certain number may be elected in that way. That is not the case in every model. So what I can only urge people to do is to make sure that in our communities, whether it's McBride or Valemount, Prince George, all of these communities, that we're setting up opportunities for information, for people to learn about the models and learn about the choices. And you know, as I said here in Valemount today, I'm not here to tell people how to vote. I'm here to urge people to find out, get the information they require in order to make an informed decision. It has the potential to make significant changes in ridings right across BC. And you know, at this point in time, I can honestly say that the reaction here at my breakfast and also at other meetings I've had across the province, people have no idea that A, it's going to happen imminently, and B, they don't understand the models. And I can tell you, I've spent a lot of time trying to sort this out, and I today cannot explicitly tell you the differences between the 3 models that are being proposed to British Columbians.
Well, I would say it's not only just the models, it's just the basic concept. What is the difference? Why would we want to change? Why would we need to change? Why would we consider changing, right? And what is the other, you know, the other broad definition of what that is? So I think we have a lot of learning to do and a very short time to do it.
We do, and I think the proponents of change would argue that there would be a parliament that is more reflective of a greater number of voters under a model that is proportional. So, for example, if you look at the Green Party today, if you looked at the percentage of their vote in the last election, they would have potentially 15 or 16 or 17 members in the legislature based on the proportion of vote that they garnered across the province. So I think the argument from the yes side would be that there would be better representation that is more reflective of a broader group of voters. I don't agree with that. I think that we need a system that provides clarity. We need a system that allows people to choose their MLA by name, by putting an X beside their name. And the other thing, I think people need to look at the issue of stability around the world where governments are chosen under a proportional model. If you look at Italy, for example, if you look at the number of governments they've had since World War II, I think it numbers about 65. Well, think about that. That's on average an election a year. You don't get a lot of time to get your work done in that kind of circumstance. Whereas in Canada, since that period of time, it's probably about 22 or so elections over that period of time. So I'm worried about the efficiency of decision making, how those MLAs are chosen, and the biggest issue that is, I think, detrimental to the region we live in is that the referendum itself has no threshold, for example, around voter turnout. Very few voters can send in their envelope, and they ultimately, because there is no threshold, 50% plus one of whoever sends in their envelope will determine the future of voting and the electoral system in our province. If you go take a look at other jurisdictions...
Can I interrupt you there
Sure.
for a second? So if 100 people sent in a ballot,
Yes.
they would be determining
Yes.
what happens in British Columbia politics.
And I actually put that question to the Attorney General directly in the legislature. So there is no minimum requirement in terms of how many ballots are received, and the answer was no. So yes, and my concern is the geographic distribution of people in British Columbia. If you look at strong urban centers, large urban centers like Vancouver or Victoria, if there's a greater turnout of people in those areas, our votes will simply be swamped by the mathematics of where people live. So, my strongest message today is it's coming. You're going to get an envelope in the mail. Please take the time to get informed. There are resources available online, and there will be a yes and no campaign. But I'm also urging people within the community, including the Chamber of Commerce and others, to host forums where people can get a better sense of why make the change, if we're going to make it, what would we choose, or if we're better to just stick with the certainty of today's system.
Right, absolutely. Last question I have for you is about the Liberal Party. So how far are we into the election now? Is it 2 years, halfway?
It's about I think we just celebrated 1 year of the NDP government.
Okay, so we're a little bit of ways through.
It feels like a lot longer than that.
Okay, I'll give you that. What is the Liberal Party planning to do moving forward? How are they going to change, and how are they going to address what happened in the last election to carry the party forward in the next election?
It's a really good question, and it was a pretty eye-opening circumstance. I personally had some, my best electoral outcome. Technically, we won the election. We had more votes, but with the coalition government that formed, obviously it put us firmly in opposition. And to be honest, it doesn't look like there's going to be a change in that anytime too soon. Although with a by-election being held, potentially, if Leonard Krogh is elected the mayor of Nanaimo, that can change the circumstances. I think it's a time for us to reflect on what British Columbians said to us. And I think one of the strong messages was, you need to listen. Focusing on balanced budgets and having a strong economy are important, but it's what you do with the resources that you have in British Columbia. Looking at, more attention to things like childcare, seniors housing, those issues that really touch the hearts of British Columbians. And I think a lot of people felt that we were too focused on growing an economy and balanced budgets. Those are still important to me. And I think they matter to British Columbians. But I think they wanted to see us listen and perhaps have a better understanding of those issues that really touch the hearts of people. Just issues that you've talked about, seniors housing here in rural communities, those kinds of things. So it's a time of reflection and policy evaluation, looking at listening to British Columbians, sorting out what it is we need to do to reflect the needs of the ridings we represent. And everything will change if there is an electoral system change in British Columbia. So we'll know more about that after the end of November. Because I think if we change the electoral system, I think you will see very significant changes for political parties in British Columbia. There are currently, I think, about 27 registered parties in the province, and I think you'll see an even greater number, and who knows what will happen to mainstream political parties under a new electoral system. So it's a time of reflection, a time of obviously coalescing around a new leader. But for me, one thing hasn't changed, and that is, as the MLA for this part of British Columbia, my job is to work hard to take the messages that I heard here today and throughout my visits in the Valley to Victoria, and work every day to make sure that my constituents are well represented.
Well, thank you very much. We're always pleased to have you here with us, pleased with the representation that you've had, and best of luck for the future. Let's see what happens.
Thanks so very much. I appreciate the time today.
Great, thank you.